I work at Lieutenant Dunstable Hospital, which is one of the two sites designated for bariatric surgery for East of England. The other hospital is Homerton. Uh, Thanks, Sanjay, for inviting me to participate in this symposium. Now,
There you go.
I do not have any conflict of interest to declare. This is the fourth IFSO Global Registry report from 51 countries, 14 national registries. If you look at that, there are 394,000 procedures, and sleeve gastrectomy is the majority of them. So it confirms as a predominant procedure performed worldwide. There are a couple of case reports of esophageal adenocarcinoma 5 years after laparoscopic sleeve gastrectomy. The first one is from Argentina. A 48-year-old male patient had a sleeve gastrectomy and developed GORD symptoms 15 months following this. 5 years post laparoscopic sleeve gastrectomy, he developed esophageal adenocarcinoma. He went on to have neoadjuvant chemo, but developed liver mets during this process and is being considered for palliative chemo. There's another case report from France. There's a 55-year-old lady who had a pre-op 2-centimeter Barrett's esophagus. After an MDT discussion, it was decided that she could have laparoscopic sleeve gastrectomy. 3 years following this, she developed esophageal adenocarcinoma in Barrett's from 30 to 35 centimeters. Because she had lots of comorbidities and she had several other abdominal procedures like incisional hernia repair, they decided to treat her endoscopically, and the EMR confirmed this is a T1 lesion with good prognostic features. Hence, she's being followed up endoscopically. The literature that I searched had all these levels of evidence, level 1 being randomized controlled trials, 2 being non-randomized, 3 being comparative studies, and 4 is expert committee reports or opinions. The grade A required at least 1 RCT, and grade B at least 1 non-randomized, and grade C was expert opinions. This is the BSG guidelines, which defines Barrett's esophagus as an acquired condition of the esophagus in which the distal portion of the esophagus, the squamous epithelium, is replaced by the metaplastic columnar epithelium, which should be endoscopically visible at least 1 centimeter above the GOJ junction and has to be confirmed histologically. The prevalence in an Italian study was about 1.3%, which involved about 1,033 individuals. A Swedish study confirmed this to be a 1.6% based on 1,000 people. The BSc guideline states that there's no screening for endoscopy in an unselected population. However, it asks us to consider seriously in patients with chronic GORD symptoms with one of the multiple risk factors, at least 3, which is male sex, 50 years or older, white race, and obesity. However, if there's a first degree relative with Barrett's or esophageal adenocarcinoma, these risk factors can be relaxed. Why are there concerns of Barrett's esophagus? It's a surrogate indicator of ongoing reflux. The symptoms may be masked because of the insensitive metaplastic epithelium. It is also pre-malignant with the risks of low-grade dysplasia progressing to high-grade carcinoma in situ and esophageal adenocarcinoma. There are 2 types of Barrett's that we know of. A short segment, which is less than 3 centimeters. The risk of this progressing to adenocarcinoma, it's 0.07% per year. The long segment, which is 3 centimeters or more than 3 centimeters, the risk is 0.25% per year. One should not confuse this with erosive esophagitis, as explained in this LA grading, where there is mucosal breaks in grade A, but they are bridging at the tops in grade B, more than 75% involved in grade D and less than 75% in grade C. The endoscopic reporting of Barrett's, according to BSc guidelines, should follow the Prague criteria, where the circumferential extent and the maximum extent should be documented, and any separate islands above the columnar line segment should also be noted. You see this picture, that shows the hiatus area there. That's the GOJ, and that's the maximum extent, and this is the circular element. That's depicted here. That the circular component is C3, which is 3 centimeters, and the maximum is 7 centimeters. But one should not biopsy the hiatus hernia. The NOCA database, which published its results in March 2019, which involved about 21,000 patients between April 2015 and March 2017, where there was 4,700 patients treated with curative intent. The Barrett surveillance per se yielded about 0.6% of these cancers. 2,059 patients had high-grade dysplasia. 2/3 underwent endoscopic treatment. 19 had RFA, 4% had surgery, and 2% had PDT and argon plasma coagulation. The overall operative mortality was 2.4% for 30-day and 3.59% for 90-day mortality. I put up the slide to see whether there is an increase in esophageal adenocarcinoma with an increase in laparoscopic sleeve gastrectomies, which you're going to see in the future. Again, the BSc guidelines recommends proton pump inhibitors for symptomatic management. PPIs are the ones which have the best clinical profile. It also states that anti-reflux surgery is not superior to pharmacological suppression, but it asks us to consider if the patients have a poor or partial symptomatic response to PPIs. Does sleeve gastrectomy predispose to Barrett's esophagus? This is a multi-center study involving 5 centers in Italy and France. 90 patients had sleeve gastrectomy, 66 were females. They had an upper GI endoscopy at 5 years. The follow-up was between 6 and 7 years. The prevalence was 18.8%. The most statistically significant association was weight loss failure with Barrett's esophagus. The prevalence of GERD symptoms increased during the study from 22% to 76%, and erosive esophagitis from 10 to 41%. The usage of PPIs increased from 10 to 52% during the follow-up period. Does sleeve gastrectomy have any effect on gastroesophageal reflux symptoms? Yes, it does. This study is based in Netherlands. There were 20 patients. These patients had preoperative and postoperative 24-hour pH monitoring and impedance matching 3 months following laparoscopic sleeve gastrectomy. There's a good correlation between increased acid exposure and increased GERD symptoms. The consequences of this are for future development for complications of GERD, which is Barrett's esophagus. Does sleeve gastrectomy predispose to Barrett's esophagus? This is a UK study which evaluated the prevalence of GERD, esophagitis, and Barrett's esophagus after sleeve gastrectomy. 46 studies totaling more than 10,000 patients. This meta-analysis found an increase in postoperative GERD by 19%, and more importantly, de novo reflux by 23%. The long-term prevalence of esophagitis was 28%, and Barrett's was 8%. 4% of these patients required conversion to a bypass just because of severe reflux. Are there any anatomical and physiological changes after sleeve gastrectomy? There are. The lower esophageal sphincter becomes incompetent. There's a dilatation of the cardia. There's increased intragastric pressure. There's a certain amount of acid secretion in the gastric remnant. There's faster gastric emptying. And there's open non-contractive pylorus. These predispose to bile reflux. How do we diagnose GERD or Barrett's esophagus after sleeve gastrectomy? Obviously, endoscopy is the most effective method. However, there are conflicting views. One should differentiate between esophagitis, Barrett's, hiatus hernia. In this study, up to 63% incidence of new onset esophagitis. Should sleeve gastrectomies undergo routine endoscopy as screening for Barrett's esophagus? There's an if-so position. Even though it says sleeve gastrectomy is secure and efficient metabolic procedure, it considers Barrett's esophagus as a contraindication for sleeve gastrectomy. The presence of Barrett's esophagus or the severity of esophagitis doesn't always correlate with the symptomatology. In 2 longitudinal studies, de novo Barrett's esophagus was found in the case of about 15 to 17%, with no correlation between symptomatology and endoscopy results. Consequently, a preoperative screening endoscopy and a surveillance postoperative endoscopy is mandatory after year 1, 3, and 5 years, and later each 10 years. However, during this process, if there's a de novo Barrett's esophagus after sleeve, this should be more frequent. This is the BSc guidelines for management of Barrett's esophagus. There's a pathway for non-dysplastic and a pathway for dysplastic. If the length is less than 3 centimeters with intestinal metaplasia, the advice is to repeat OGD every 3 to 5 years. And if the length is more than 3 centimeters, every 2 to 3 years, I repeat OGD. For dysplastic one, depending on whether it's low grade or high grade, the follow-up is with either therapeutic intervention or RFA for low grade. For high grade, after an MDT discussion, an EMR, and if the specimen shows if it is T1A or less, then endoscopic follow-up. T1B is for surgery. There are several surgical options: the cardioesophagectomy with interpositions, jejunal interposition, the short segment Barrett's less than 3 centimeters, and colonic interposition is also being considered. What are the problems with conventional management of GERD after Barrett's esophagus after sleeve gastrectomy? Yes, we can manage Barrett's esophagus, but it doesn't address the uncontrolled reflux due to sleeve gastrectomy. If there are peptic strictures, if we dilate the lower esophageal sphincter, it may potentially worsen the reflux. And in esophageal adenocarcinoma and surgical management, the gastric conduit is not sufficient. Are there any other options? This is a study from Sunderland, conversion of sleeve to Roux-en-Y gastric bypass. There were 10 sleeve gastrectomies, they converted into a Roux-en-Y gastric bypass for GERD. The mean follow-up was 16 months. 100% of patients reported improvement in symptoms. 80% patients were able to stop their antacid medications completely. This is our paper, which is a systematic reviewed meta-analysis. The effect of Roux-en-Y gastric bypass on Barrett's esophagus. This involved 8 studies of about 10,779 patients. 117 patients with Barrett's esophagus underwent Roux-en-Y gastric bypass. The follow-up was greater than a year. It showed 56% regression of Barrett's esophagus. There's significant regression of both short segment and long segment, which is statistically significant. There's 93% improvement in GERD, and the odds of regression of Barrett's esophagus after Roux-en-Y gastric bypass compared to progression is 31.2%. I think there's enough evidence to convert sleeve gastrectomies for Roux-en-Y gastric bypass for Barrett's esophagus. Thanks for listening.
Excellent talk, Jambu. I have one question. In your clinical practice, do you do pre-op endoscopy on all your sleeves? And in the consent process, what do you tell the patient about Barrett's? And therefore, over the last 5 years, has your sleeve practice gone down compared to real?
Answering your first question, the answer is no. Do not perform routinely upper GI endoscopies for Barrett patients unless they are due for a single anastomosis. Answering your second question, if they are known to have Barrett's, we tend not to do sleeve gastrectomies. We advise them to do gastric. If there are high-risk situations, we may consider prior to considering.
So when you tell them about the risk of Barrett's and then they Google it and they come back and are worried about the future risk of adenocarcinoma, have you had patients coming back with that kind of issue?
Not in our practice so far, but we are expecting them to come through.
Thank you.
I have a question. I mean, that's interesting. You've presented a IFSO statement saying that in presence of Barrett esophagus, a sleeve gastrectomy is contraindicated. Is the IFSO not suggesting that we do an upper GI endoscopy in all cases? That's one. The second thing is the case report on esophageal adenocarcinoma or gastroesophageal junction adenocarcinoma are quite interesting because one was in a patient who didn't have Barrett. The other one is in a patient with short Barrett. And with my kind of esophageal cancer hat on, I can say that the progression of long Barrett segment is very, very unpredictable and certainly not a very strong predictor for cancer progression. So I think that with a sleeve gastrectomy, probably we create something that is very different compared to the environment in the esophagus in the normal anatomy. And probably we should give up using the Barrett surveillance as such a, or at least we should stop considering such a strong indicator for progression to cancer. What I mean is we should be more aggressive in scoping patients, because I don't think that the Barrett statistic, the Barrett surveillance with the yield so low as you showed is very reliable in predicting which patient is going to progress to cancer. Have you looked in alternative to the endoscopic Barrett surveillance in predicting sort of progression to cancer? Or are you aware of any?
Maybe the endosponge might answer your question. With reference to the IFSO statement, I think yes, we should scope patients before we go into a sleeve gastrectomy, not necessarily for. And then the second point I entirely agree with is there are things we don't know exactly.
Can you raise your voice?
Why sleeve patients tend to have more progression towards Barrett's disease. That's short segment or long segment. The second case report is on a patient who did not have Barrett's before. That's the first one to have Barrett's.
Bruno.
We have just a question. We have the honor to have 3 world presidents of IFSO here in this meeting, which I think is very exceptional. And looking to the IFSO guidelines, I think that they have postulated in Madrid. Anyway, so regarding the endoscopic surveillance, I mean, I will ask to the presidents as well as to all surgeons here, having done quite a lot of sleeves, who already called the patients that they've operated in the past to come over to have an endoscopic control of that, because that's going to be critical anyway. I'm going to ask you to Antonio, Jacques,
I
who
think we
knows?
do.
I mean,
We do endoscopy. You know, I think all.
it's not pre-op. No, Antonio, not pre-op. It's post-op.
Not
It's post-op.
post-op. I mean, post-op, you have to.
And you did it already. You did it already before the papers were coming out.
No,
to Barrett.
afterward, decided, I think you have to be aware of all the information we have, So on the other hand, why are you doing our studies? For not paying attention at all? I don't agree. I think we have to do that. It doesn't matter.
This was a discussion when we had in Oxford, and finally after all bariatric procedures, we had an incidence of esophageal cancer after gastric surgery, not only just bariatric, or gastric surgery, and also of gastric cancer. And it's a very high for the esophageal cancer, from 4.6 per 100,000 millimeters to 11.2. It's much more marketable, and because we can do all the restrictive procedures, BBG, all others, also the band, gastric banding, has an incidence of the esophageal cancer. And the gastric cancer is only just a in remnant. 75% of all cancers after gastric surgery are remnant. And all our are anastomotic cancers. So therefore maybe the long period that we are waiting for, the time interval is around 15 to 25 years after the gastric surgery to have cancer. This is what we learned in the last report. Musella published just meta-analysis for cancer after bariatric surgery. Their recommendation is after 5 to 7 years, each patient should have upper end.
But it's anyway going to be a huge task in the future. I mean, first of all, you can mention that to your patient. Okay, first checkup is going to be then. But you see on a regular way, we have to, you're going to structurize your consultation. You're going to mention that. We have to call back all the sleeves that we have done. I mean, it's a huge task. Take into consideration the high dropout in the follow-up of quite a lot of those patients. So. It's not only important to mention that. I think it's completely correct. That's another way. But the practical consequences are not unforeseen. I mean, it's going to be tough. Jacques, what do you think?
Yeah, obviously. But I think one aspect we cannot forget is Helicobacter. And all the studies that you guys are referring to, nobody knows what the status is of Helicobacter. And I think that's a very important feature as well that we need to highlight that I haven't heard here.
But if I may say something, Bruno, idea is that, first of all, we did ask all the 68 nations that are in the IFSO Federation, who is accepting the concept of doing gastroscopy before the operation. And there are 25 to 30% of the group of the national involved in IFSO are not doing it. So one point is that IFSO made position statement, and another point is how the National Society receive and applicate the position statement. But the second point, let me add one final sentence, is that in Italian, I think it's obvious that it's much better. We believe that we should do gastroscopy before the operation. And the second point is that, of course, we should follow up the patient with doing at least a gastroscopy after sleeve gastrectomy after 5 years. But I understand that this is a heavy job for endoscopists and gastroenterologists, but it is very similar to what we say when a patient comes to our office that is smoking. We know that there is evidence that they should stop smoking, but if you tell them, look, in 5 years you should receive the endoscopy to be sure that you are not developing a pre-malignant lesion, and once you say this before the operation, and this is enough. I mean, at some stage, this bariatric patient and population need to be conscious of what they are doing. They are not doing breast reconstruction for cosmetic. They are doing an aggressive operation on the GI tract. So I think we should advise the patient to do that and try to do that. But of course, I'm doing a study on 100 patients who had iatoplasty following the sleeve gastrectomy, and at 5 and 7 years follow-up, and there are 30% of patients that strongly refuse to have gastroscopy, although we call them many times. What we can do?
So in UK, if I could comment in UK, the situation in UK, we only 30% of the units do pre-operative endoscopy, because we done a survey 4 years ago.
But the costume doesn't justify you don't have to do things, you know what I mean? You know, the costume of the unit, you know, the preference of the unit, you know, the expenses and so on, doesn't justify that you don't advise the patient to do that. It's a huge mistake to justify, don't do nothing because of the costume.
I agree with
smoking is dangerous for the heart, you know. It doesn't matter, you have to fight against smoking. You know, again, you know, there is no reason, there is no way of justifying, you know, it's going to be a tough issue. You have to advise the patient. If the patient doesn't do that, this is what to do for her. But we, as you know, Bruno asked, you know, have to take into account helicobacter pylori endoscopy, but you have to advise the patient to do endoscopy. Yeah.
Thank you.
You know, it's our duty.
Sure. Thank you, Antonio. For the sake of time, we're going to move on to the next debate. Thank you, Jambo, for that great talk.